Hey, good morning. Whoops, I'm making my phone stand move by dancing around here. Good morning. How are you doing this morning? I'm just playing a little bit of beautiful music by Kamari and Manveer. This is from their album, what is the album? Kundalini Technology. I love this album. I love their music. Thank you, Kamari and Manveer, for your amazing sacred sounds. And hey, morning, welcome. Just going to turn my music down now. Welcome to day 2 of my road to rapture. And today's live is called I Abandoned God and the Earth Did Not Move, sadly. So, hello and welcome. I'll just do a really quick intro for those of you watching this who don't know me. I am Shakti Sundari. I'm a priestess of love and sacred sexuality. I teach embodied awareness and awakening to women. I'm doing a series of lives every weekday morning for the next 3 weeks on my road to rapture, as a build-up to the launch of my book, which I have here today to show you, Rapture, a guide to sexual and spiritual awakening for women. And on October the 9th, the book is going to be on sale on Amazon, and October the 28th, the course that I teach in conjunction with the book is going to be running live for the third cycle around. So I'm going to pick up now where I left off yesterday, day 1. And yeah, I abandoned God and the earth did not move. That is my theme. So at the end of yesterday's live, I was kind of feeling quite touched and quite moved by retelling my own story, actually, and feeling back into the wounds, the traumas, and the sadness of the split within my teenage self. And actually, you know, I do this for a reason. In my book and in the course, one of the first things that we do is we write our own erotic her story, because in this reflection, looking back now with fresh eyes, we begin to see things that we obviously didn't see at the time, that are at the root very often of any challenges, difficulties, or blocks we might now be experiencing, not just in our sex lives and our relationships, but in our lives as a whole. So it serves a purpose. Anyway, so today, let me just encapsulate and summarize. I guess I was speaking yesterday very much about my idyllic childhood, growing up in Germany by the forest, being in nature, playing, being very physical, very active, very expressive, creative, and free. There was no sense of any thing or person or institution impinging upon my natural expression of the joy of being. And my childhood was very, very joyful. And then there was this shift, this rupture that happened to coincide directly with menarche, with puberty. I moved countries, so I moved back to the UK, which was, for my experience of it, a very repressive, more detached, old-fashioned, cold kind of culture. I moved into an all-girls grammar school from a mixed, very free, liberal and progressive school. I became a Christian with all those moral doctrines of right and wrong and good and bad, but also the culture that I then moved into in terms of the school and then the education system had those Christian morals within it, imprinted into it, and also the culture itself was very patriarchal. And again, obviously this isn't something I knew and saw and recognized at the time. It's something that I've seen looking back. And of course, then there was the family context, my own personal family context of a lack of love, a lack of support, a lack of feeling safe, my boundaries being overridden consistently. And all of this was the framework for my explosion of desire and sexual energy, because that's what happens when we go into menarche and our hormones kick in you know, as women, as we bleed, and of course as men, as you begin to self-pleasure and experience ejaculation and that surge of testosterone, you know, our hormones come online and suddenly we have this huge sexual desire, and we don't really know what to do with it because nobody in our society and culture is showing, modeling, or teaching us how to integrate and navigate that massive shift from girl to woman, from boy to man, but I'm addressing women with my work, you know. So I had this huge explosion of sexual desire and sexual energy waking up, of intellectual expansion. You know, I was super bright, creative expansion, physical changes and physical growth, and spiritual expansion. This hunger for God just came for me in parallel with the explosion of my sexual energy. For me, they came online simultaneously. Who am I? What am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? And I couldn't find the answers in my family, in my society, in my culture, but I looked for the answers in the church, because that was the only place for me that was a safe haven at the time. But just, you know, compare and contrast youth, joy, freedom, liberation, expression, unhampered, creative essence expressing itself, life force, right? And then the feeling of everything being squashed, repressed, shut down, not allowed, morally coded as wrong, demeaned, denied. So this sense of squashing oppression and the framework of patriarchy, of a society where the masculine and the male gaze was privileged and determined everything to such a degree that it was completely unquestioned. Completely unquestioned. And just if you want to know, like as a time reference, I was born in 1964, so I was growing up in the late 60s and early 70s. So my experience was, and looking around, I didn't see any women who were modeling sexual empowerment, sovereignty. Didn't see it. Wasn't modeled. Yes, intellectual achievement was valued, and I was at an all-girls grammar school and I was a high achiever, you know, so excellence academically, winning was valued, becoming first. So I also played competitive tennis. That was valued. But being a woman, that wasn't valued in my family, in my culture. And I experienced then, as I moved into menarche, and I'm sure every woman can relate to this, suddenly becoming an object. So going to school in the mornings, age 12 or 13, being catcalled, hooted at, comments thrown at me, occasionally attempts to touch me, sitting on the bus next to men who are reading The Sun with page 3 with a woman's body on show, while I was sitting there feeling extremely uncomfortable. And then imagining that those men's eyes would be like turning to me. Not that I had big boobs like that anyway. So then I already felt like inadequate, right? So the programming is and was to be disempowered, to lack energy, to not have a voice, to regard myself as an object rather than a subject. The programming was to be a good girl, to shut up, to not question, to put my hand up, to have to ask questions, right? To get good grades, to be a good person, to be a good girl, to fit in, to not make waves, to smile, to be pleasant, to be accommodating. That was the conditioning of those times for women. And so within this patriarchal, objectifying culture, sex was in the shadows. It was everywhere and yet wrong. You know, so there's complete split between, well, everywhere I looked, my dad was openly ogling women while he was with me, driving the car, looking them up and down. Men were openly ogling me, making comments, catcalls. All the magazines were, I began to get Cosmopolitan, and all of that was about sex. TV shows, smutty jokes, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, you know, such puerile, immature humor, right? And I knew that my dad had this stash of pornography, which I discovered. So sex was everywhere, and I could see that men wanted women to be alluring and sexually, physically attractive and available. And yet there was no place for me in that, for my own agency, for my own desire, for my own boundaries, you know, for what felt comfortable for me was not even in consideration. And at the same time, within the church and the Christian culture, there was this programming of, well, sex is sinful, it's dirty, it's rude, it's wrong, it's bad. So this split was set up within my body, within my psyche, within my being. And from where I sit and look, that split is still everywhere, in everyone's body and psyche. And for me, from my looking, that is the root of violence. It's the root of perversion. It's the root of why there is such thing as rape and abuse and sexual violence and just violence per se, conflict in the world, this split within ourselves, from ourselves and our true nature. So then this programming of secrecy, so sex is something that everyone wants, everyone's obviously doing, everyone's obviously wanting to know about, it's hugely attractive, right? And yet it's secret, we don't talk about it, it's shameful, it's guilty, it's wrong. Do you see how that sets us all up to be hating on ourselves and feeling bad about our desire, and therefore it goes underground, right? And that's what creates the perversion in the world. And just to give you an illustration of how that's still so pervasive, you know, in my work, obviously I teach and I speak openly about the body, all parts of the body, including the womb and the genitals and the breasts, right? And I talk openly about sex and sexuality, not to allure, not to titillate, but to educate and to shift the narrative from a very unconscious, divided, separated narrative to something more holistic and spiritually earth, body, heaven and earth integrating, informed. But I get a lot of attention because of that, and I consistently get messages from men who misinterpret the fact that I'm speaking openly, honestly, vulnerably and transparently about the body and sexuality, and mistaking that as an invitation or a signal that I'm available to them, right? This is how fucked up things are. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I had an image on my Instagram of the vulva, and it was like a not a cartoon but a graphic illustration of the vulva designed for educational purposes, so women and men could be informed about what a vulva actually looks like, what a clitoris actually looks like, so the external and then the internal. There were a couple of pages. It's there for education, because you'd be surprised how many women don't even know about their own sexual anatomy. And of course, how can you possibly experience the sexual pleasure and the spiritual opening that you are designed for if you feel ashamed or disgusted by or disconnected from your vulva? Not possible. This is part of the programming, you know, this shame, this secrecy, this guilt, this wrong programming is to separate you, woman, from your pleasure, from your power, from your essence. So anyway, so I had put this picture of a vulva on my Instagram feed, and I got a flurry of messages from men approaching me or blowing me kisses because of this, right? And I'm like, what the heck? You know, but this is the level of splitting, of perversion of the natural beingness, the natural divinity of our sexuality that is still so pervasive in the world. So anyway, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, and I just want to read you something from The Art of Everyday Ecstasy by Margot Anand. So Margot Anand is, you know, a tantric master, who was one of the formative teachers. She studied with Osho and was then one of the formative teachers of Tantra in the Western world. And, you know, this was one of the books I read a long time ago when I stepped onto this path. And what she has to say really correlates to what I've just shared in terms of my own personal story. And I'm sure so many of you can relate. So she speaks about the art of everyday ecstasy. And for me, that ecstasy very much is a parallel or correlates with the rapture that I speak about in my experience and my book. I use the word rapture. For me, that means ecstasy, spiritually, sexually, whole body, the sense of bliss, joy, transcendence that we can experience in the making love with life, in the making love with another, in the meeting of our God selves in any moment. So let me just read a little bit because it will underscore what I've just shared about my personal story. Most people are not educated to value and recognize life's sacred dimension. They do not recognize that every moment is pregnant with ecstasy. Every moment is pregnant with ecstasy. For ecstatic states are not separate or opposed to ordinary life. Ecstasy, and I'm kind of going through quickly, ecstasy transcends sex. So guys, it's not all about sex. We can learn to cultivate the quality of a great lover in the way we live life, our daily life. Ecstatic moments can be cultivated on a daily basis when we enter into a love affair with life. Ecstasy is both our true nature and a state to be realized through self-mastery. And here, this passage in particular is a really wonderful reflection on what I was talking about how my own experience shifted from joyful, erotic innocence to separation, shame, fear, and shadow. Ecstatic awakening comes by surprise, and it is very much like the everyday ecstasy we knew and lost as children, when life was touched with wonder and each moment was an adventure, a plunge into the unknown. Remember the passion of shouting loud and jumping high and spinning until you drop. The unbearably sweet smell of newly mown grass, the thrill of colours in your crayon box, your joy at hearing a favourite bedtime story, the wonder of raindrops on a spider web, the mystery of a shadow on the wall. To grow up, we build an ego that sets boundaries between the self inside and the world outside. And society initiates us into a world ruled by laws, structure, obedience, and duty, gradually replacing the ecstatic mind of childhood with the more rigid and conventional mind of adulthood. As this ego takes on a life and personality of its own, it controls and directs our attention, limiting our vision to matters of fear, hope, and survival, and cutting us off from the freedom and joy we knew as children. Its constant chatter, judgments, and interpretations filter out much that is essential to our wholeness, separating us from ourselves and the world of others in which we live. After a while, every spontaneous impulse, every natural urge to express a feeling or an emotion must struggle through a labyrinth of socially conditioned responses. We become educated, but in the process, we lose our true self, our original face. After years of learning to fit in, we forget how to open to the wonder and complexity of life. The energy of love, the affirmative life force, is our original innocence that contains within itself an unconditional yes to life, and it becomes distorted and suffused with repression, shame, guilt. We live in an anti-ecstatic society based on the conceived separation between flesh and spirit. We are encouraged and taught to repress our sexual nature, to doubt our mystical and spiritual nature, and to fear whatever does not conform to conventional behavior. But when we ignore the sacredness of life and the possibility of living life ecstatically, we risk losing ourself, our soul, in the process. And that is why I do what I do, to reclaim ourselves and our souls by returning to the rapture, which is our innocent eros, our true potential, our true nature. So I said that today I was going to talk about the first time that I had sex, and I've been leading up to that, and really there's not that much to be said, and how, I guess for me, that goes hand in hand with abandoning God. So I was a Christian all the way up to when I went to university to being 21. 21 was the shift. And at university I met my first and had my first proper boyfriend, and I was still a virgin at 21. You know, that those Christian morals went really deep. But then two things happened for me, right? So I was in the church, and you know what? I was so sincere, I was so earnest, I was so devoted, right, to that path. I so wanted to be good, I so wanted to know God. But the honest truth is, I never had the experience of, like, there were a lot of people around me who were speaking about meeting Jesus and knowing Jesus. I never came to know Jesus. And I never really had an internal experience of knowing God. It was comforting, it felt safe, it felt good, but I never met Jesus. I never met God in the church, in religion. I did meet God in a very different way later on, and that's what this book is all about, but not in the church, not in the congregation, not there. And so I had my first proper boyfriend. We were beginning to explore our sexuality together very gently and very slowly. And then I just began to see, look, in this church, they're judging everybody else the whole time. So the message I was given was that sex is wrong before marriage, it's sinful, and everybody who's not a Christian is going to go to hell. That was basically the message. But I looked around the church and I was like, hang on a minute. There are some really boring, annoying, not very pleasant people in this congregation. And I know loads of people who are really kind, good people who don't go to church, who are not Christians. And I just don't buy the story that they're going to hell. That just doesn't feel true for me. It doesn't feel right. It feels like a contradiction in terms, in fact, from the Christian teachings. And then this thing about sex being wrong, how can that be wrong? Like, I love this man. You know, he's a really good man. We've been together. We were together for a year before we had sex, as in like full penetrative sex. How can that possibly be wrong? I love him. He loves me. He's a good man. I'm a good woman. It feels good. How could this possibly be wrong? And so I left the church. That was the end of it for me. And I decided I was going to consummate our relationship after a year. And so the fated moment came. I'd got the pill, because that's what we did in those days. You know, girls got the pill so that they could have sex. Didn't think about whether that was what that would do to my body, what that would do to my hormones, didn't even question it. So unaware in those days. And you had to wait a month before you could do it. The exciting day came, and finally, you know, there was such a build up to it. So we went upstairs, we were in his parents' house, and they'd gone out for something, and we crept upstairs to do it, right? And I'm not going to go into the details, but all I'm going to say is that about 15 minutes later, it was over, and I lay there and I thought, dear God, is that what all this fuss has been about? Really? That's what everyone's been trying to stop me from doing? Really? And obviously, the earth didn't move. It was quite a letdown after waiting for 21 years to have that pretty ordinary experience. Luckily, you know, things did get better over time. And again, that's what the book is about, really. But I gotta be honest, the first time I had sex, the earth did not move at all. And I wonder how many people shared that experience. You know, the thing is, when there's so much censorship around something and so much repression, there's so many fantasies, so many ideals, so many build-ups to it. Whereas if it was allowed to simply unfold naturally and organically, as it would do without all of these strictures, I'm certain the experience would be so different. But of course, by that time, I'd already been programmed really to submit, to tolerate, to endure, rather than to have any sense that what was happening to me was in my power to determine, because, you know, I'd grown up in this very patriarchal system. So the earth definitely did not move. Tomorrow, I'm going to carry on with this story of my road to rapture and talk about the next part in this, which was marriage. So sexuality within marriage. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. I wonder how many people will be able to relate what I talk about there. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's been fun to share, and I've ended feeling really happy today rather than really sad like I did yesterday, just because it's just so funny, you know, the big joke of what a letdown that was after waiting so long, and so many stories about how sinful it was. I mean, goodness sake. So if you would come and join me tomorrow, 9 o'clock. That's the first thing I have to say. Second thing to say is, if anything's resonated for you and you want to reach out, you can comment below or reach me here on Facebook or through my website, shaktisundari.com. There's a Rapture book launch on Saturday, October the 9th. A whole day of live events, special guests, prizes, competitions, book readings, and you're very welcome. There's a Facebook group. I'll put the link for that below. And my course, Rapture, which runs, the book basically and the course go together. You don't need one to do the other, but if you're interested in doing the course, Sexual and Spiritually Awakening for Women, then I'll pop the link for that course below, because it's starting on October the 28th for the third round, and I would love you to join me. So thank you so much for being here today. Have a beautiful day. Have an ecstatic day. Remember what it is to see the world with the eyes of wonder. Lots of love, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Namaste.